All right. Hi, everyone. I am joined today by Greg Dember, the author of the new book, Say Hello to Metamodernism, Understanding Today's Culture of Ironesty, Felt Experience, and Empathic Reflexivity. And we are here today to talk about mainly the book. Before I start asking my questions, my interview questions, let me say a few things first about the book, because I just finished reading it and I really enjoyed it. And the project of the book is concerned with art and popular culture, uh, and the deeper underlying visions that give rise to different forms of creating, different ways of knowing. And the book is, I don't know if you agree with me, you can let me know in a moment. The book, for me, one of the things that is really impressive about it and enjoyable is how it combines a set of opposites. So it's at the same time very large scale. It's about a lot of things, fields, cultural domains, but it's also small scale. It's very focused in particular works of art. It's ambitious and at the same time it's modest. It's very personal
Hmm.
and at the same time it's about social and cultural phenomena. It's very accessible, but it's also challenging and gives us more horizons to explore. And one last combination of opposites, it has lots of links to places outside of the book and other works beyond the book. But at the same time, it stands on its own and it is self contained and it has its own self sufficient interiority. So, in other words, what I'm expressing with all those is to say that it is a work of metamodernism in itself. So, I enjoyed that aspect of it, and I was wondering if it was self conscious or you would agree.
Well, I really appreciate that description. It makes me feel like I've succeeded with the book. And it's interesting, though. I agree with you that I just kind of strove to meet all of those criteria that you described. And I have also asked myself the question, like, how meta modern is my book itself? And it never occurred to me to answer that last question with the things that you said. So um, I would have conceded, so-called conceded that my book's not particularly meta modern in the way I wrote it or anything like that.
Right.
But you have now convinced me that I could say, yes, it is. So I appreciate that.
Great, great, great. So thanks again for joining me. Congratulations on this wonderful book. Maybe we can first start talking about the process, the process of writing a book, and in particular, if you went through different stages while writing it, while working on it.
Yeah. I guess in some sense, the writing of the book actually begins with the writing of the What is Meta Modern website that I run with Linda Ceriello. So we just started out writing, fairly short little blurbs about different meta modern cultural artifacts that we saw on the web.
Mhm.
Um, but then at some point into that, I felt like that needed to exist in a book form with kind of longer, more thoughtful essays, and kind of a with a coherent point of view. Um, as probably, well, I mean, as you know, and maybe probably a lot of your viewers know, I'm not the inventor of the concept of metamodernism, nor is my thinking partner Linda. I wanted to kind of get to put forth what my concept is, and sometimes I almost said our concept because Linda and I work so closely together, but we actually differ in some ways. So this is my book and my project. Anyway, so then when I started writing, when actually setting out to write a book, the first chapter that I wrote was, I guess it's chapter 2 on the epistemes, because I just figured that would kind of be the backdrop of everything else that came. And I knew that that information, it's just sort of like an overview of modernism and postmodernism and what I kind of call with a big umbrella term tradition that comes before modernism. I knew that that information is, out there in a lot of places, not the least being Wikipedia. So I actually purposely did not do research or reading, and I just kind of let it all flow out as best as I could, and then I checked my work. Um, and and it still kind of comes out sounding like an encyclopedia article, and making it a little bit inconsistent with the rest of the book, but it is what it is. Um, and then I was at the time involved in a life coaching. I was a client of a life coach, and she had me read a bunch of books, and one of them, the author very self-consciously started the book and framed it with his own personal experience, his own kind of anecdotal life experience before he launched into some more generalizable topics. And so I was like, oh, that's how I'll start my book. So that's kind of the genesis of chapter one, in which I kind of give a personal account of my growing up with postmodernism and my speculating on what might come after postmodernism before it had actually come, and then my encounter with things that we eventually call metamodern, and that's all from a very personal point of view. And then I wrote I wrote the piece on Miranda July's movie You, Me, and Everyone We Know. And then I learned that when you're trying to pitch a nonfiction book to publishers or agents, that you don't generally complete the book. You get a little bit of it done, and then you put your proposal together. Um, so that kind of stalled me out for a while. Um, and then I realized I might as well just keep writing it while I was looking for that publisher. Um, And so then from that point on, it was just kind of a hodgepodge of like, now it's time for me to write about this film. Now it's time for me to write about this band. And some of the material in the book is expansions of pieces that I wrote for our website, but most of it's not. Um, So, I mean, I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I guess like it has just been a part of my life for more years than I care to admit. Um, just kind of there with me by my side, and I would have, I'd have an hour or two in
Mhm.
a cafe and bang out another section, and then kind of not attend to it for a while, and then eventually it was almost done, and then I did find my publisher
Mhm.
just before I was gonna give up on that and self-publish.
Mhm.
So then we made a deadline, and then I, just finished the book by the
Mhm.
deadline.
Nice, great. One of the things actually that I really like about this book is that it has the quality of, when I read it, it has the quality of, in in no way it feels deadline driven.
Hmm.
It feels like, a very patient labor of love over a very open-ended period of time,
Hmm.
not pressured by, some kind of like a journalistic piece or a person who wants to really meet a deadline. So it has that quality. And I was fascinated by your comments about chapter two. I didn't notice that it has the, and maybe I don't know. I think that Wikipedia or encyclopedic, maybe the
Hmm.
encyclopedic quality of it is because uh, because of the function that it is doing. It is doing a different kind of work compared to the
Hmm.
other chapters. And I didn't. It has your style. It has your voice.
Okay.
I wouldn't say it has switched to a encyclopedic voice, but I was aware that your it's like there is an encyclopedia somewhere that you're talking about, as opposed
Hmm.
to you're rehearsing encyclopedia. But you had
Hmm.
something in a different way. You were mindful of a different kind of thing in chapter
Hmm.
2.
Yeah.
And then we get this lively discussion of works of art and, some personal anecdotes in the rest of the chapters. But yeah, I would say chapter 2 is definitely interesting and very useful. Now, my next question is about the kind of audience that you had or you had in mind. General audience interested in, I assume, general audience that is interested in art, culture, popular culture. And I wanted to ask you what that means to you, what that audience, what kind of image you have of that audience, that generalist audience, and the both that, the audience, and the effects that you'd like to have on them.
Yeah. I'd say I have a few different audience segments in mind, and the one you named is maybe the main audience. But if I were going to put it into groups, and of course, many people would fall into many of these categories, not just being one or the other. Um, but and in fact, the audience that I would really like to reach the most is arts journalists. So I would like to introduce to them the concept of metamodernism so that it can be used in their work when they are analyzing and interpreting art, popular culture, all of the things that I approach in my book. So, if I have one mission with this book, it's to get the term and the concept of metamodernism into the field of, of the general field of arts criticism and arts journalism. Um, and then, although the book does not pretend, or I don't pretend that the book is an academic work, and it's not published by an academic publisher, and I'm not an academic, um, I, I do have sort of a framework that I present in the book, and I do know that it has been, treated as useful by actual academics. And so to whatever extent they are comfortable drawing from my book in their work, that's great. And um, without leaving my other audiences behind, I did try to make it kind of as um, I tried to write it in such a way that a scholar or an academic would be able to make use of the work if they contextualized it the way they needed to. And then, maybe the audience that you described, um, and so far, my experience of that has been like my personal friends who have bought and read the book. Um, is so just for the general audience of fans of the arts and of popular culture, not only did I want to introduce them to the concept of metamodernism, but I also wanted to sort of model a way of being intellectual, but also doing it in a fun way, kind of at the same time. Just so it's almost like um, you read the book, and I've never written nonfiction before. I more identify as an artist in the form of being a songwriter, right?
Mhm.
And so what I'm doing with when I write a song is I'm kind of taking something that's inside me and delivering it, and then it takes on a life of its own, and then the listener, um, it integrates with the listener's own emotional life and does something for them. And so with the book, I'm trying to kind of do that, but instead of for my um, raw emotional life, I'm doing it for kind of my intellectual life. So it's like a conversation that I'm having with my readers. It sounds kind of pretentious to say like you get a little bit of Greg's mind, but um, just to offer like a way of adding a layer of understanding to people's experience of art. Does that make
Yeah,
sense?
yeah. That's great. It actually leads naturally to my next question.
Wait, I
Like
have one more group.
opening up. Yeah, opening up. Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm just gonna just say my one other kind of
Sure, sure, please.
group is like professionals in different fields, like even advertising and marketing professionals, or political consultants,
Hmm.
or pastors. So it's like you can use this book as a guide to one aspect of what culture is like, and it might help you do your work more effectively in
Yeah.
reaching people and in understanding what's going on with the people that you're trying to work with.
Hmm. 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 Yeah.
Okay, that's all that.
Yeah, great, great. That makes sense. Uh, so you talked about in terms of your own writing that you have artistic interests, you have um, creative projects, but you have this added layer now of public uh, uh, work of doing something more intellectual, more philosophical, more theoretical. So opening up the theme here that I'm touching on is opening up spaces. And in fact, one way I think to describe the book is in terms of possibilities. On the one hand, possibilities, and on the other hand, prohibitions.
Mhm.
Prohibitions, possibilities in a culture. Any culture frowns upon tacitly, or maybe not so tacitly sometimes. Especially uh, in your discussions, prohibitions and possibilities regarding our feelings and our felt experience and our expressions, and even just the experience itself before expression. So, in other words, the book describes modernist and postmodernist attitudes in terms of a range of possibilities and prohibitions, and you identify, I think, metamodernist condition as one that offers most amount of possibility. Um, First question, is that a fair assessment? And my follow-up is there anything that is prohibited in the um, according to the metamodernist stance? Does the metamodernist stance have its own prohibitions that I didn't consider?
That's a really interesting question, and way of thinking about it. Because I don't think I say in the book that metamodern offers the most possibilities, but that is something you could draw from it, and kind of put in the words that you did. But just to kind of look at it from the other side and to answer your question about prohibition, in a sense, it offers the most possibility. It depends on, like using the language of logic. If you think of it as a union of sets, then you would say it offers the most possibilities because you get all of modernism and you get all of postmodernism, and that's bigger. But if you think of it as an intersection of
Mhm.
sets, in a sense, it's more prohibitive because the expressions have to meet the criteria of both modernism and postmodernism.
Right. Yes.
So it's not that it offers the greatest set of possibilities, it's that it offers possibilities that are located in that intersection specifically, which may not have been allowable in the other two previous epistemes. So I
Mhm.
would just say it offers a different set of possibilities, not the
Mhm.
most.
Mhm. Mhm.
But that was fun to think through.
Yeah, my inspiration for that, I found one of the passages that kind of made me think along those lines. This is from page 15, where you say, "For many of us, this paradox opened the door into a place, so a place where we could breathe a sigh of relief, feeling that all of our emotional parts had a home."
Okay. Um,
So that in that sense of possibilities, that if we find our way into that intersection, into that maybe smaller space, then that achievement pays off in giving us home. That
yeah. Yeah. So um, it's not that. Okay, I've changed my mind. You're
Mhm.
right.
But I and now I also changed my mind after listening to you,
Yeah.
because in terms of an achievement, it is an intersection, and
Yeah.
it does have its prohibition, and the prohibition is maybe if we call it prohibition, quote unquote,
Yeah.
is to claim all those previously identified areas. We can do all these things. We can like just be ironic purely and
The
just be,
prohibition is you can't be purely
yeah,
one or purely the
yeah,
other.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
And then in the sense of like breathing a sigh of relief because we've now created a space for all of our interior experience, it's the most expansive set of interior experiences, but it's not the most expansive sort of set of theoretical
Mhm,
conceptual experiences, maybe.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Um, one of my concerns was that this is kind of related to what we were talking about here. One of my concerns was, okay, when somebody gets on board or starts to appreciate the meta-modernist stance or temperament, sensibility, maybe that's they say, okay, I'm good now. I
Hmm.
found what I like, and I'm this, and this is the kind of art I consume. But I really I really appreciate it. You have a very brief comment about, I think it was about Infinite Jest. You said you had an initial encounter with it, and after some time you go back to it now, and you say, I think I'm maybe slightly paraphrasing. Now you can appreciate it in a new way because you had your metamodernist needs met elsewhere. So once this space is identified, we can have a renewed sense of enjoyment and engagement with
Hmm.
non-metamodernist art and culture.
Yeah.
So that's also, I really enjoyed reading about that. It is not necessarily, it doesn't have to lead to a dogma. In your case, it doesn't, clearly.
Yeah.
Uh,
So when you're immersed in a cultural world that's exclusively postmodern, um, you may find yourself eventually exhausted by it and just kind of really put off, therefore, by the postmodern work. Um, but then when you encounter art that's metamodern, whatever it was that was bugging you about the postmodern art is no longer an issue because the things that were lacking in it you're now getting, and now like I can just go and watch Seinfeld reruns and just laugh and appreciate the cleverness of it
sure.
without sitting there going like, okay, this is funny, but aren't they ever going to be genuine about their feelings? Which is kind of how I was with
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
back in the
Yeah.
day.
Yeah. Same. I relate to that too. It's like the Seinfeld room now is one of the rooms I can go to, and the door is open. The totality of the space that I can inhabit is larger than that.
Right.
That's that space. Okay. Uh, Two of the metaphors that you introduce and you help us think with, is the metaphor of oscillation. And then later, a little bit later in the book, we also get introduced to the metaphor of braiding. So oscillation, going back and forth between two different attitudes. And then braiding makes it maybe more synchronous, or has that, it has that idea. It implies that you don't have to, at any given point, just to get one of these two. You can get to a point where both exist. So
Hmm.
could you speak a little bit about uh, what each metaphor achieves and how they might complement each other?
Yeah. I in a talk that I gave at a metamodernism conference, and that I've actually put a transcription of it on Medium if people want to read it. It's called Oscillation Revisited. So I explore kind of some of that territory in ways that I actually do not get into in the book. So in that talk, I actually lay out four different models or metaphors, and two of them are the first two are two different kinds of oscillation.
Mhm.
Um, so I have hermeneutic or interpretive oscillation and structural oscillation. And well, the structural oscillation is probably what people usually imagine when they hear about oscillation between modern and postmodern aspects in metamodern works, which is um, the artwork is itself, clearly in some sort of objective way, switching between displaying a, say a sincere attitude and then an ironic attitude and then a sincere attitude and then an ironic attitude over time. And that's the oscillation. Um, but the kind of oscillation that I think is actually a little bit more interesting than that is what I call hermeneutic oscillation, and that's where the artwork is not changing, and especially like if the artwork is like a painting or something that does not have a chronological element to it, it's that as the viewer experiences and interprets the artwork, inexorably the logic of it that first leads them to interpret it in a, say, ironic way, um, as they go deeper into that, they are then forced by the way the artwork works. They're forced to flip and say, "No, I've been wrong. It's not ironic. It's actually extremely sincere." And then, as they inhabit the sincere interpretation of it, it leads them to feel, "Oh no, this whole thing is a joke," and that's the oscillation. So the oscillation is in the interpretation of the
Mhm,
viewer.
mhm, mhm,
Um, so that's hermeneutic and structural oscillation. Um, and then the braiding is, so structural oscillation and braiding, I guess, usually occur across time. Although I suppose structural oscillation could be like different sections of a painting. Um,
mhm.
I feel like I'm rambling here. Hopefully
No,
people can
no.
follow
Yeah.
me. Braiding, though, is very much like an across time thing. So, for example, in the book, I talk about the film Me, You, and Everyone We Know. And the way I describe the film, it's like two separate films, one of which is very postmodern and one of which is very modern. And they're moving along at the same time as each other, braided together.
Mhm,
And it's not really that like it's one and then the other. And it's not really that as the viewer, you can't decide whether it's ironic or it's sincere, or it's just that they're both there. Um, and one way they're not touching each other, but they are in relation to each other. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah. The,
And then the fourth dynamic that I suggested in that talk is, I call juxtaposition. And that's perhaps sort of like the least powerfully metamodern dynamic. That that's kind of the one where you're like, okay, I guess it's metamodern, but it's not a great example of it. And that's just where like there's some metamodern, I mean, there's some postmodern elements and there's some modern elements, but they're not really in relationship to each other. They're just kind of both there. And it's just almost like um, a museum that has a modern exhibit and a postmodern
right.
exhibit.
Mhm, mhm,
And it's all there. So as a taken as a whole, the museum is kind of metamodern, but not in a really dynamic, interesting way.
mhm, mhm. When you were describing the structural oscillation, I was reminded of these, and maybe in your paper you include references to the so-called bistable images, like the Necker cube.
Hmm.
And the Necker cube is an ambiguous image of a cube, and if the viewer focuses on seeing it in one way, uh, automatically the cube shifts. And that
Yeah.
shift is because of the way we are paying attention. If we started the other way, with the shift would go the other way. So,
Yeah, that's a perfect metaphor for what I'm talking
mhm,
about. Um, because, and this is an important thing to clarify, the relation between, polarities in metamodernism, the oscillation between the polarities, it's not of any kind of polarity. It has to specifically be a modernist, postmodern
right. Yes.
polarity.
Okay. Yeah.
So I think like in the examples you're talking about, it's not that like when you're looking at it the one way, you're like, oh, this is universalist. And then when you're looking at it the other way, you're like, oh, this is fragmentary. But it's a perfect metaphor,
Mhm.
the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah, yeah, the kind of shift that also relies on the participation from the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, uh, now I want to ask you a question about the content of the chapters and their the process for individual chapters, because the chapters are all well written and they're all extensively researched, and so it's hard to know for me if a particular chapter maybe was more challenging, or it, you had to spend more time on it, or maybe one of them was easier to write. So I, based on just my own curiosity, I was interested in hearing about
Oh,
if you if the if that equal distribution right now in the end product corresponds to an equal distribution
right.
of effort. Yeah.
I think that the one that was most outside of my wheelhouse and therefore took the most work and the most research was I think it's I don't remember the numbers of my chapters, but I think it's chapter 9 is or maybe chapter 8 is
Mhm.
the
Philosophy.
philosophy and religion. The philosophy and religion because I'm not a philosopher. And so and in that chapter though, for the viewers, what I do is I look at some movements in philosophy that have come up in the last 20, 25 years, which is the period that we consider metamodern. And so the question is, uh, because we can talk about modernist and postmodern philosophers. And so there's always the question like, is metamodernism just about art, or does it also cover these other areas?
Mhm.
So, so it's asking the question, have there been developments in philosophy that have also gone in a metamodern direction, just like there are in these other areas? And since I'm not a philosopher, I had to come in it as like, does it sound metamodern? Does it feel metamodern?
Mhm.
So I kind of like I'm starting with kind of back of the book, thumbnail
Mhm.
descriptions of these philosophical movements, and then and like one of them, for example, is object oriented ontology, and like oh, it kind of sounds metamodern, and then I have to read the book, you know, I have to
Sure.
actually read the book,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
then these philosophical books assume that you're familiar with the whole history of philosophy. So I had to do a lot of looking up and, um, hoping and trusting that my somewhat superficial understanding of these things were still mostly on target. Um, so that took the most work. And then the other half of the book is on religion. And I identify two movements within contemporary religion. One is the emergent church as a movement in evangelical Christianity. And again, there, like, I had personal experiences with encounters with individuals who were in that movement. And so, from a personal anecdotal point of view, it seemed metamodern, but like, I don't know the whole scope of, um, I don't know everything about Christianity that the people who are in that world
Mhm.
know. And I haven't read all the books that they read and all that. So, I had to stretch out for that. And then the other area I cover is the spiritual but not religious, which my thinking partner Linda Ciriello actually makes the center of her metamodernism studies. So in that case, I had the advantage of being able to just ask her
Mhm.
questions and read her work and everything. But again, I'm not. I'm actually like there is an expert on it over here, and then I'm writing about it. So that's kind of stepping out of my wheelhouse and comfort zone.
Mhm. It's probably a skill and an art in its own right to, without getting too deeply involved in the details of a field, to just try to check the pulse of it, the pulse of what's going on in
Hmm.
philosophy and religion.
Yeah.
Feeling the pulse. I think for that, for doing that, sometimes getting into too much detail might work against that, because going into too much detail in a particular work we might feel too much pulse that is not really present, a pulse that isn't present in a larger scale, in a bigger
Yeah.
picture. So
And
I
I
think.
had a I'll go ahead and say that I had a little bit of tension with my editor
Mhm,
around that chapter, um, because he's a religious studies scholar and he's steeped in philosophy.
mhm,
And when I'm talking about film and music and television, that all felt very natural to him. But with the philosophy and religion chapter, it wasn't that he was saying what I did wasn't up to snuff, but just because he's so from those fields, he he was like, "What are you even doing? What do you, how, because to him, that was a completely different world from film and music and television.
yeah,
And for him, when you take on, when you address a philosophical project, um, you wouldn't normally just be kind of like looking at it for its features and its cultural features. You would be engaging it in this particular way that philosophers do. And so he was trying to understand like how I thought that engaging with object-oriented ontology enhanced my understanding of metamodernism. And I had to try to make clear that it was more that I was just trying to use metamodernism to make sense of object-oriented ontology.
mhm,
Does that
mhm.
make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
That itself, that I think that's a very that interesting topic with lots of potential to discuss. That way of engaging that might escape somebody who is officially or professionally in that discipline. I had
Mm-hmm.
a similar experience recently. I gave a presentation to a small audience of academics, and at the end, some of them told me, "What are you doing?"
Yeah.
And I realized I've been out of academia for 4 or 5 years now, about 4 years, and I've acquired new sensibilities and different ways of communicating that it might be strange to
Yeah.
people. It's like, yeah, I understood what you were saying, but I don't know why you're talking this way. And having those, maybe that could also be classified in different uh, types of epistemes, uh, the way of handling a topic, a way of
Mm-hmm.
handling an area. Yeah, very interesting. So going back to again earlier in the book, uh, namely chapter 2, you discuss uh, three positions, three general positions or areas: tradition, uh, modernism, and postmodernism.
Mm-hmm.
And you pay a lot of attention within those three. You pay a lot of attention to modernism and postmodernism as a kind maybe two poles to set up this situation of oscillation or braiding. I was wondering, how would this book be different if you had included a more extensive discussion of tradition? If tradition or the classical or Renaissance art and culture had that been foregrounded more, tradition especially, would we
Yeah.
have a uh, different project?
Oh, that's a really provocative question, and I have a bunch of angles to come at it from.
Mhm,
Um, I guess I want to start by saying that it's not that I excluded a deep discussion of tradition because say just because I didn't have enough space in the book, or for some other practical reason like that. Whereas like I would have wanted to have done a section on stand-up, meta-modern stand-up comedy or meta-modern visual art or whatever, but there were practical reasons to not include those. Whereas the tradition is excluded actually because of the actual kind of conceptual structure of metamodernism. Um, so metamodernism is not simply like taking things from different time periods and putting them together. Um,
mhm,
and it's also not a top-down theoretical concept that we then either look for examples of or that we encourage people to create examples of. The book is not encouraging people to make meta-modern art, it's just saying that it's there, right? And so it's based on, so the whole concept and the theorization of metamodernism is based on empirical observation. Um, and so, and I might be wrong, this could be argued, but like I would put forth the position that we can see in our culture a lot of examples of artworks and other cultural products that have this pattern of oscillation between modern and postmodern polarities, but we don't see artworks that have oscillations, say, between postmodern and traditional aspects or modern and traditional aspects. I mean, there may be some, I'm sure there are some, but like not enough to define an episteme, not enough to
Mhm.
define a concept. And then another thing to say is that um, modern and postmodern, when we're talking about the oscillation, modern and postmodern aren't even really the best words for identifying that polarity. And I've talked about this with Tim Vermeulen, who's one of the most known names in the metamodernism, and he and his thinking partner Robin von Deniker introduced the oscillation model, in relation to metamodernism. But I've talked about it, in personal conversations with him, and he generally agreed with me um, that we're trying to get at a certain kind of duality that there isn't a better languaging for. There's no better languaging for that we've been able to discover besides modern and postmodern, but we don't really mean modern and postmodern.
Yes.
Um, we mean something like affirming versus questioning, or we mean
Mhm.
something like figure versus context.
Mhm.
But any one of those that you try on as an alternative to modern and postmodern ends up having its deficiencies,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But so there is this polarity, and that polarity is complete in itself. There is no tradition in the polarity that we're talking about. Does that make
Tradition
sense?
is in the background,
Yeah.
or maybe it's in the ground or in the tacitly somewhere.
Yes, and
Mm,
that
yeah.
that actually gets to another one of the angles I was
Mhm.
going to address your question with,
Mhm.
is that um, there's a significant break from tradition, and in my work I use tradition as a very broad umbrella term to include classical and Renaissance and indigenous and all these things that many people would think it was ridiculous that I lump them all together, but for my work it makes sense to lump them together because I see there being a major break at the inception of modernism. So modernism is just like this big thing that happened in human culture that's separating itself from everything that came before. And then postmodernism and metamodernism are really just kind of wavelets or echo waves or refinements or fractalizations of the big thing of modernism.
Mhm.
And that's why they're called postmodernism and metamodernism. But the periods that you named that are even earlier are have their own names. They're not modernism with some sort of a prefix before them,
Mhm.
right? So so metamodernism has is a reaction to postmodernism, and postmodernism is a reaction to modernism, um, historically.
Mhm.
And then another kind of thing that comes up for me is that part of postmodernism is the revival of the pre-modern. Um, it's a rejection of modernism's rejection of tradition.
Yeah.
So the traditional pre-modern stuff is already kind of baked in to postmodernism.
Mhm.
Um,
That's a good point.
so yeah.
That's a great point. Want to take a note, add a quick note about your um, somewhat like being a little bit dissatisfied with the labels modernism and postmodernism. Uh,
Well, can I just
yeah,
clarify
sure.
one thing
Yeah,
about that?
yeah, yeah.
Um, I'm not at all dissatisfied when those are the labels for historical periods. I'm dissatisfied with that we don't have anything better to do. I mean, we can't find a better solution than using the labels of those historical periods also as the names of these just kind of conceptual
Mhm.
aesthetic registers.
And for the identification of metamodernism.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I wanted to say that because of chapter two, we get, this is another way in which your book could be described as metamodernist itself.
Hmm.
Because you include a kind of double framing method.
Hmm.
Chapter two is the broader frame of, okay, let's agree that I'm going to use modernism and metamodernism in
Hmm.
these ways to set up the polarity. And within that broader frame, we get the smaller frames when we engage with the actual works of art.
Oh,
So it works.
I love that. That's great.
I was personally able to completely set aside that, oh, maybe these words won't apply everywhere and maybe they don't always
Huh.
communicate what we want to communicate. So it
Huh.
took care of that concern for me.
Oh, I love that. That's great.
Yeah, great, great. Um, okay, let's thanks for tackling that question of tradition. It was I know it was a lot. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like to touch on before we conclude the interview
Um, I don't
about
think
the book?
so. I mean, it's fascinating and elucidating for me to talk about all of this stuff with you. And I'm sure if you prompted me with more questions, we could go on for many more hours, but it would just be random if I picked something to add in at this
The
point.
Yeah, I would add one more thing that I like about the structure of your argument and presentation. The forerunners, Jonathan Richman,
Hmm.
David Foster Wallace,
Hmm.
they're figures who kind of belong, but at the same time don't because they were earlier
Hmm.
than the movement uh, self-conscious became self-conscious or took life or gather enough momentum to become a thing.
Yeah, gather enough momentum.
Yeah. Uh, and a lot of other great features. When you get to science in chapter 8, I love that because I feel like my suspicion is that, or my guess is that that's just a byproduct of the rest of your work being so rigorous that just as a byproduct, when you get to science, your intuition is, in my opinion, is correct. And it's
Hmm.
deeply correct to put science outside of the present discussion and say that's a different kind of thing.
Yeah,
Culture is what the kind of culture and the domains of art and creativity that we're talking about could be distinguished from science. We don't necessarily have to say we have metamodernist scientists or
yeah.
postmodernists. And I really appreciated that. It reminded me of Alva Noe in one of his books, Varieties of Presence, has in his last chapter, because there he starts with philosophy and science, phenomenology, and he
Hmm.
gets to culture in his last chapter. And he says,
Oh,
okay, culture is different.
yeah.
Culture
Okay.
is not what I'm talking about. So
So
that's
it's
kind
the
of like,
inverse
yeah,
of
exactly,
that.
exactly.
Yeah, and I am glad you're bringing that up, and I can make a comment on that.
Mhm.
Is that, what we're doing with this metamodernism stuff is and postmodernism and modernism is we're making a taxonomy and we're applying a taxonomy to the real world. Um, and I'm I'm inherently cautious about doing that. And so it's really important for me to kind of check myself and always keep in mind like not everything is going to fit into modern, postmodern, or metamodern. Like some things like that taxonomy is not even relevant. It's there, it's not the right question to be asking
Hmm.
about the thing,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah.
And that's just something I hope everybody would keep in mind. And I would be embarrassed if people, um, thought I was guilty of trying to, attack every question with
Hmm.
this framework that I lay out
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
the book.
Yeah.
So, in my short kind of comment on is there metamodern science, I do say like, well, if there was a metamodern science, it might be like this, and maybe here's a few examples of it. But like overall, science is science, and if science is either basically modernist, and it should be, um, or um, it just shouldn't even be put in it. It wouldn't work if it was stuck in one of these categories
Hmm.
alone.
Especially the natural sciences like physics and
Yeah.
biology. Maybe social sciences and the human sciences could be discussed under that light. But any project on the horizon for you now? Or I mean, I know that's a cliche question to ask.
No, I'm actually glad you asked me because in another podcast interview I did recently, they asked and I completely forgot this one particular
Mm.
project that I could have
Okay,
um,
nice. This is the continuation of that. Nice.
mentioned. So, and I was like, it's okay, Greg, because you're going to be going on to Davood's
Mm.
podcast. And if he asks you that question, remember. So,
I'm so glad I did.
yeah. So, well, I have a section in the book on the singer-songwriter Sufjan Stevens.
Mhm, mhm.
And kind of like my next big project is I'm part of a team of editors who are editing an academic multi-author volume on Sufjan Stevens. And I guess I'll be co-writing the introduction of it, but mostly, just editing and conceiving of the whole thing as a
Great.
whole. And that's just really exciting because all of the proposals that have come in, are unearthing just all these different interesting angles of Sufjan's work and of his biography. And so, and it's like, yeah, I'm really lucky. Like I finished this book and then I get to do another project
Yeah,
related to
it's
metamodernism.
meaningfully connected to
Yeah.
this project. Great. Yeah, I must say I really love your treatment of particular works of art, music, TV shows, films, novels. It was really great. I wasn't familiar with all of them, but that was not an obstacle.
Oh,
Your
good.
descriptions uh, were good. They were sufficient for understanding your points, and at the same time generate curiosity. I want to go and check them out. Miranda July, I'm so curious about
Mm.
her. Unfortunately, it's a little bit hard to like. For example, Netflix doesn't have her movies, but or movie that one particular. But I'm gonna find it and watch it. Same goes for other references in your book. So thank you.
I think that for movies, it seems that you can usually find something on Apple
Yeah,
TV, but you have to pay for it.
yeah, yeah.
Like stuff you can't find on the streaming services that you're subscribed to, you can just go to Apple and
That's right.
pay.
That's right. Or rent. But
Yeah,
if you rent and then you find that, oh, I really love this one, but
and you
it's
buy. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. Well,
But I'm glad to hear that about how your reaction to me and everyone, because I like literally spell out the whole
the
plot in
three
there. And
different,
so,
yeah, three
yeah.
different
And so if it
renditions.
still leaves things for you to be curious about, then I feel like I did my job really well.
Mhm. Well, Greg, once again, congratulations on this great book. And looking forward to seeing what you do next. And looking forward to, others reading this book, and then I'll be able to discuss it with more people.
Hmm.
So I wholeheartedly recommend this one. Thanks again for joining me, and goodbye to our audience. And I'll
Thank
pause the
you.
recording, and we can say goodbye to each other.
Thanks. I really enjoyed this discussion.
My pleasure. Thank you.